Before I get started this morning, I want to take a moment of personal privilege. Welcome Rabbi Jonathan Lubliner and his wife Susan. Some of you may have known Jonathan as a young boy running around the sanctuary, but I know him as a colleague and a friend. We served in congregations very close to each other. Jonathan was our Masada Kedushin for Sharon and our wedding. So it's wonderful to have you here. You also may know that Rabbi Jonathan Lubliner is the son of Rabbi Emmanuel Lubliner, who is the rabbi of this congregation. So it's indeed an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to have you here this morning. I had no idea until this week that there were so many ways to express one's displeasure with the Israeli government. Extremely disappointed, deeply disappointed, deeply pained, deeply concerned, profound consternation, profound disappointment, strongly opposes. They really had to pull out the thesaurus for this week. You all know my feelings about Israel, my deep love, my eternal commitment to its thriving survival. You know the pride that I have in my daughter, who is a second lieutenant in the Israeli army. And you know my reservations about the current government. I spoke in detail about this issue on Shabbat, Parshat Vayikra, back in March. And then I published that sermon in our monthly Hamvaser bulletin. And you can read it there, or you can actually go on YouTube and watch it. And as you know, I am not shy about voicing my opinion. And on this Shabbat Nahamu, the Shabbat of consolation, I find myself with no consolation. Just sadness that has crept into my observance of Shabbat. This week, as we observed the Black Fast of Tisha B'Av, in which we learned over and over again that the destruction of the temple was because of internal strife. And this week, the conflict of Jews was on full display. And I can't help but wonder what all of the anti-Semites in the world are saying as they watch a water cannon from the Israeli army on Israeli citizens. Now, I know my daughter told me it's not as big as you're seeing on the news. It's much quieter, but the United States media loves this kind of conflict, and so they broadcast it in far greater detail than it may actually be occurring, and on a much greater scale than probably happened. But no matter, the conflict is substantive. And we watched in horror this week as our own people had conflict with our own people. Back in March, when the protests began in earnest, I spoke of how proud I was about the peaceful protests and how it never is going to get to anything like what we saw this week. I applauded the Jewish people for speaking with their feet and their voices, not with their fists, as the protests spilled into now unchartable territory. This week, my heart broke, along with my idealism about the state of Israel. This was not the Israel that stood together, bringing thousands and thousands of Jews from the collapsed Iron Curtain. This is not the Jewish people that I so proudly declare when thousands of Ethiopians made it to Israel. People who walked through the desert like our ancestors to get on a metal flying machine they'd never seen before, in the faith that the Jewish people will always care for one another. This is not the state of Israel of the startup nation or the Israel of the elite military prowess capable of miraculous victories. This is not the Israel of holy places and modern culture. This is the Israel struggling like every other democracy. And it does have an ugly underbelly. And in many ways, as a 57-year-old, my romanticized, glamorized, idealized version of Israel was shattered. And there's nothing more painful than to realize, like we often do with our own parents, that they're just not perfect, that they have flaws like everybody else. And it's even more painful when those flaws are on display for the whole world. Israeli judge Moshe Golan wrote, "The principle of majority decision is a delicate craft, as it must ensure the majority decision does not harm the rights of the minority, but guard against a situation where the guarantee of rights of the minority will not harm the principle of representationists, according to which the decision rests with the representative republic." It's a delicate balancing act. In March, Elliot Abrams posed the core question: in every democracy, governments derive their power from winning elections. From that common point on, the differences are profound. What restraints, if any, are placed on pure majority rule? And conversely, on judiciaries that restrain the majority's preferences? What are the checks and balances that guarantee democratic rule but equally protect the minority's rights? See, democracies are messy. God knows ours here in America is not a paradigm of excellence. Trying to elect leaders that stay away from the tribalism that their party breeds and seek what is best for everyone is hard. But no matter, democracies cannot deteriorate to violence, a lesson this country learned on January 6th. And you know it was a calamitous day because guess what? We don't have to say the year. Every time you know an event by the day but not the year, you know it was fully recognized, January 6th, like 9/11. Sure, we can try to understand the intricacies of the conflict, to analyze the arguments of each side, and I tell you honestly, I tried. Researching, evaluating, reading, talking to Israelis. It all rests on one word: reasonability. I still can't tell you what the whole conflict means in detail. I have broad stroke understanding, but it makes no difference. I'm still left with something far more visceral. For whatever psychological necessity I have, I need to compartmentalize my feelings about Israel. One chamber for the heart and one chamber for the brain. But still, I'm left with this nagging, gnawing feeling. How can Jews treat each other like this? How did we get here? How did we get to a moment like this? I know it has happened over and over in the history of the Jewish people, from the Maccabees back to Joseph and his brothers. But I still can't wrap my head around it in a modern age. This morning's Haftorah calls for it. The author of Isaiah 41, living during the 6th century BC, writing under the exile, prays, Nahamu, Nahamu Ami. Comfort, comfort my people. Yomar Adonai Elohechem. That's what God says. The author is offering a prophecy, but I think it's more a prayer. And a prayer that must come with an action on our part. To which I say, Nahamu, Nahamu Ami. Comfort our people. God, please help us in this moment. This week's Parsha, we read the 10 Commandments. And we know that this 10 Commandments is really the second set that we received. The first, you may recall, were smashed by Moses as he made his way down the mountain to confront the Jewish people about the golden calf. He was so furious about what had happened, he smashed the work of God. Moses is then forced to pick up the pieces, quite literally and figuratively, and place them in the Ark of the Covenant eventually, alongside the whole tablets. I can only imagine what Moses must have felt every time he looked at the Ark. And he knew it had the whole 10 Commandments, but also the broken pieces, the work of his hands. I can only imagine the shame Moses must have felt when he looked at the Ark of the Covenant and saw the broken pieces that he was responsible for, the destruction he was capable of. Look, we all know what's going on between the lines in Israel. We know of Bibi Netanyahu's corruption and a desire to have a control over the judiciary seems quite obvious. There will come a moment in which Bibi will have to look at the broken pieces of Israeli society. And maybe he'll feel some shame. There's no question in my mind that him having a heart procedure this week had to do with his breaking heart over a nation that should be unified. Harriet Schleifer and William Daroff, chair and CEO, respectively, of the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, wrote, "We must remember the dangers that discord and division can pose to the Jewish people. Like all religions, we have a history of internal strife turned violent. Sunni and Shia, Protestant and Catholic. But we have to do better. Not because the world is watching, though they are, but because we don't have the luxury. We're a very small people. We can disagree. It's actually in our DNA. But we have to find a way to compromise. And compromise means that no one is going to be completely happy. The conflict is about the fundamental question of how the majority rules over the minority. Natan Sharansky, arguably one of the greatest modern living heroes for the Jewish people, says democracy means both the rule of the majority and that there are individual rights that no majority can take away. He may have been quoting, or at least paraphrasing, Thomas Jefferson, who in his first inaugural address in 1801 said, "All will bear in mind the sacred principle that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will not be rightful, to be rightful must be reasonable. That the minority possesses their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression." The lesson for today is simple. We have to turn down the violence, and we have to turn down the volume. As American Jews, we have to turn down the volume. J Street, AIPAC, WZO, and all the other Alphabet Israel advocacy groups must turn down the volume. Every moment has taken us to this moment. And we have to recognize that this is an opportunity to have some perspective on the current state of affairs in Israel. And we know everyone is going to take sides. But we have to turn down the volume. You have to have a sense of reasonableness. It's hard. It's challenging. But we have no choice. We all must remain calm, respectful, loving, kind. When we feel attacked, we cannot lash out. We must come back over and over and again, never quitting and never turning violent. Tomorrow, we're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate the wonderful union of Naomi and Jonathan. And they're going to stand under the chuppah tomorrow. And at the very end of the ceremony, they're going to break a glass. It's not lost on me that the very last act they'll do before they go out into the world as husband and wife is to break something. The glass being broken is traditionally understood as the moment where we recall the destruction of the temple. But more poignantly, it reminds us that once we've broken something, it's almost impossible to put it back the way it was. So I'll say to you again tomorrow, as I say to you today, be careful with each other. Be careful with the words you use with each other, because you can't take them back. To which I say it's the same thing to all of us. Be careful the way we interact with each other. Be careful. Be so very careful. One last piece of Torah. The second verse of this morning's Haftorah says, Dibru alev Yerushalayim, speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Rabbi Yudan, the son of Rabbi Avayu, said that we should always be occupied with the consolations of Yerushalayim. B'nachamat Yerushalayim hayu oskim. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem. Dibru alev Yerushalayim, speak to the heart. We must all speak to the heart. As we say all the time, Dvarim sheyotzim min halev nichnasim lalev, words that come from the heart, enter the heart. Speak with your heart. Make this world a better place because we're kinder and gentler and more loving. And hopefully that will spill out into the world. Shabbat shalom. Yeah. We continue with Musaf. It's introduced by the Chatzi Kaddish, page 184. Please rise.